Hey everyone, welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we'll discuss regarding the concept of Palo Alto virtual router. So that's a very important concept before you start and configure some sort of routing. So let's go ahead and talk about the Palo Alto virtual router terms. Okay. So what we're discussing, I'll just write it down over here as Palo Alto virtual router. So understanding that, right? Okay, so let me take up my notepad and I will tell you with some key points so you can make a note out of it, and then we can do some example of that virtual router stuff. Just give me a sec. Here we go. All right. So it's Palo Alto Firewall virtual router. Okay, now basically in Palo Alto Firewall, what happens is there is a concept called as a virtual router or VR. Okay, you can also tell this word of virtual router as VR. Okay, and basically it's a software based router that enables routing between different networks. So unlike you have a traditional physical routers, so a virtual router operates within the firewall. So inside the firewall you have a routing database, routing engine, which is called as a virtual router. Okay, so this virtual router will be actually keeping the routing table instances and routing information. It will run routing protocol, etc., right? So the whole idea is this virtual router, it will operate within the firewall, which will allow it to manage and direct traffic between any internal and any external network. Okay, so first point, you can say a VR or a virtual router is a logical routing instance. Okay, it's a logical routing instance which is available within the firewall, right? Second point could be it will perform the same function as a physical router. So functions like packet forwarding, route learning, traffic segmentation. So whatever a physical router does, everything is done by this logical router component called as a virtual router, which is present inside your Palo Alto firewall. So, and also remember one thing, that a single Palo Alto firewall can support multiple virtual router instances. Okay, so it will allow for network isolation and policy based routing. That means if I have a PA FW1 over here, for example, which is noted here, I can have multiple virtual routers. Okay, so inside this particular PA I can have multiple virtual router instance. Let's say I've got some 4 virtual router instance and everybody will have a separate name. So this is say VR1, say this is VR2. Okay, like that. This is my VR3, this is say VR4. So at the end of the day, each virtual router instance will work separately, right? Which will work separately than the other routers, right? Now its job is to for example, if you have a couple of virtual routers over here, or let's say you have one virtual router instance, a VR1, so you attach, let us say, a couple of interfaces to that particular VR1 interface or VR1 routing instance, say interface Ethernet 1/1 and Ethernet 1/2. It is attached to that VR1 instance. That means this particular interface E1/1, E1/2 cannot be attached to any other VR instance. So if you have created VR2, that means VR2, you can go and attach some other interfaces like E1/3 or E1/4, but E1/1 and 1/2 it got attached to VR1, so it will be part of that VR1 instance only. Okay, remember that. And to achieve routing between the virtual router, so if you want to send some route from VR1 to VR2 or likewise from VR2 to VR1, to achieve the routing functionality between the virtual router, you can go ahead and use policy based routing concept. That is policy based routing. You can use static routing or dynamic routing, but this is important. That means you are going to use the concept of PBR or policy based routing to route any traffic from one virtual router to another virtual router instance. Okay, so same thing that you have in Cisco, it is things like VRF. So in Cisco routers you can create multiple VRF instances, VRF1, VRF2, and between VRFs, or by default VRFs are isolated with each from one another. So whatever routes VRF1 will keep, it will be completely isolated than other VRFs that you create or it's available, right? Yep, so keeping this point is very important in mind. So as I was discussing, the third point over here is a single Palo Alto firewall can support multiple virtual router instances, allowing for network isolation and policy based routing, allowing network isolation and policy based routing. Okay, now what are the key functions that we have in virtual routers? Let's discuss that. Key functions of a VR or for virtual router. Okay, so first of all, the virtual router is going to maintain a routing table. Like any physical router it does, it maintains a routing table. Okay, very important. So it will store the static and dynamic routes entries inside the routing table. Stores static, connected, dynamic route entries in this routing table. Okay, that's very important point. Second point could be it will learn routes dynamically. That means you can dynamically, that means you can go ahead and you can run routing protocol. That means it will support the dynamic routing protocols, like RIP, OSPF, BGP, right? Yeah, likewise it can handle static routing as well. So it can handle static routing, so we can go and manually configure static and default routes. Good. Fourth point could be it supports multiple virtual routers, right? Supports, as I've told you earlier as well, it supports multiple virtual routers. That means it will help in network segmentation and to do multi-tenancy, right? It helps in network segmentation and multi-tenancy. That's a very important word. That means for each customer, let us see, if you have multiple customers, so for each customer you can allocate a different virtual router instance. That is called as multi-tenancy. Okay, number 5 is support for inter VR routing. That means you can go ahead and you can do the routing between different VRs. So traffic between multiple VRs can be routed, as I've told you, but to do that you need to use PBR or policy based forwarding. It is called as policy based routing in open standard term, but with respect to Palo Alto term it is called as policy based forwarding or called as PBF, right? You can also use static routes in that PBF configuration design. Okay, we'll discuss those PBF stuff later. Hold on. Now what are the different components that your virtual router maintains, right? So I can say components of a virtual router. What are the different components that a virtual router should have? Okay, first is the interfaces. That means the virtual router connects to firewall interfaces, which could be, which could be a physical interfaces, which could be a VLAN based interface, which could be a tunnel based interface, loopback based interface, right? So, or virtual interfaces, right? That means the different types of interface that a VR can support are these types, as I've told you: physical interface, VLAN interface, tunnel, or loopback interfaces. So each interface should be assigned to a specific VR. Okay, so each interface should be assigned to a specific VR. So a single interface cannot be part of multiple VR at same point of time, right? Third point is basically, routing table, right? Routing, I should say this should be the discussion of the interface component itself. Yeah. Okay. Second thing is your routing table. So this is one of the component of your virtual router. That means, it will store all the known routes, which include static and dynamic learned routes, right? It will store all known routes, right, which could be static, or I could say or and whatever that you can feel like, and dynamic protocol routes. There we go. Number 3 is, it will have the routing protocol components, right? That means, it will support the protocol, support the configuration for static routes, support the configuration for dynamic routing protocols like OSPF, BGP, or RIP. It will have the directly connected routes inside it. It will have default route component inside it, right? So multiple routing protocol component can be found, like static routes, dynamic routes, default routes, right? Or might be directly connected routes. Okay. Now practically speaking, how do you go and configure a virtual router in Palo Alto, right? So let's say I have got this PA firewall 1, I log into this device. I can click on this network tab. So in my network tab, I see that I've got multiple menu over here. So out of that, just under the virtual wire, we have got virtual routers. So click on this virtual routers, and might be in my previous discussions I've created a default virtual router, right? So by default it might be blank. At your case, you can create another one. Let's say I click on add and give it a name. Say it is, as an example, I'm just giving here, say virtual router 2, something like that, and you can actually add the respective interface which you want to put inside that particular virtual router component, right? And you can see that it supports interface types, which is loopback, tunnel, VLAN, right, SD-WAN, right? I cannot see the physical interface because might be those physical interfaces are currently not activated, right? So yeah, that means I can see that E1/11/2 are there, they are activated, they are administratively they are up and active. So let's go ahead and let us create some couple of loopback interface for this testing purpose. Okay, so network interface, you can see there are different types of interfaces that is available, right? Let's say create some loopback interface for testing purpose. Say click on add, say this is loopback number 1, this is test loopback 1 interface, something like that, and I can assign to a virtual router, which I'll take it later. I can configure a security zone. Let's say this part of my trust zone. I can define it an IP address just for fun. Say it is 22 23 24 25, something like that, /24. As an example, I'm defining it. Yep, just click on that interface over here. Okay, so it should be a /32 address. That's a requirement. So that means if I either specify the CID, it should be /32, or if you leave it blank, it will take the default CID as 32. So click on OK there. You look back, one interface is created with an IP address. Now what you can do is you can go back to the virtual router and click on add. Okay, say this is VR-2. Under the interface, click on add. You find that loopback one interface is available now. So this is part of that VR2, right? And likewise, you can see that you can go and configure under the virtual router static routes. Let's say I click on OK now, and if you hit back inside this particular VR2, you can see that you can go ahead and configure static routes, based on IPv4, IPv6 addresses. You can configure redistribution. There is support for RIP, OSPF version 3 basically for IPv6, BGP, and also for multicast routing, right? So Palo Alto Firewall supports all those different types of routing protocols and processes inside a virtual router. Okay, so I hope it is as of now clear how do you create a virtual router and how do you configure one interface inside it, right? And what is a virtual router is all about at a very high level overview. You should know about it, right? Yeah. Good. So let me click on OK, and when you commit it, then this configuration will be saved inside the running config of your Palo Alto Firewall. So I hope these points are clear. I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you for watching.